This is a $135 million deal. What are you going to do about it? From the back seat, Mr. Thompson was venting his anger at the person on the phone. I graduated from Stanford University, but for certain reasons, I now work as the CEO's personal driver. We're almost at the meeting venue. What would you like to do? What's the point of a meeting? Without an interpreter, there's nothing to discuss. Apparently, the interpreter for a major business deal with a foreign company had canceled at the last minute. This is hopeless. Mr. Thompson slumped in disappointment. I can manage a conversation, at least. This single statement would go on to change my life forever. My name is Kyle. I'm not trying to brag, but my father ran a fairly successful company, and I grew up in a wealthy household, never lacking anything. Since my father did business overseas and my mother grew up abroad, they were particularly eager to expose me to foreign cultures. It's said that when you learn a foreign language after a certain age, the brain processes it separately from your native language, making it harder to master. But if you're exposed to it from infancy, your brain treats it just like your mother tongue. Because of that belief, my babysitter was a native English speaker, and I attended an international preschool. Whenever my father traveled abroad for work, my mother and I would accompany him, and I would temporarily enroll in local schools. Of course, I also worked hard on my studies in Japan. I was naturally good at academics, but on top of that, I had renowned private tutors from a young age and an ideal study environment. Thanks to that, I was always at the top of my class in elite schools. With such a smooth academic career, I could have easily entered a top national university in Japan. However, it was only natural for me to choose to study abroad. The university I chose was Stanford. There, I planned to study cutting-edge economics and eventually take over my father's company. But looking back now, this was where the gears of my family's and my own life started to go off track. By the time my admission was confirmed, the atmosphere at home was no longer the same as when I was a child. As an only child, I often spent time alone with my mother since my father was always busy with work. Even so, I had always felt my father's love for our family, and from a child's perspective, my parents had seemed like a happy couple. However, by this time, they barely spoke to each other. They only communicated through me or the housekeeper, exchanging just the necessary information. I was worried about their relationship, but as planned, I moved to the US and enrolled at Stanford. Once I started university, I got so caught up in campus life that there were days I hardly thought about my parents. To be honest, part of it was because I had my first girlfriend, a stunning beauty that everyone envied, and I was completely infatuated. The international environment, where top students from all over the world gathered, was incredibly stimulating and enriching. At the same time, I had to come to terms with my own mediocrity. I had thought I was talented, but I was struggling just to keep up with my brilliant peers, which pushed me to work even harder. For the first 2 years, I returned home during school breaks. My parents were still distant, but since there hadn't been any major changes, I felt relieved. By my third and fourth years, my studies became more demanding, and after entering graduate school, I no longer had time to return home. During my time at Stanford, my father visited me once while on a business trip. "How's Mom doing?" I asked. But even then, all he said was, "She's fine." At that moment, I still had no idea that my parents' divorce had already been finalized. I occasionally had video calls with my mother, but embarrassingly, I was too caught up in my own life to notice any changes. Using my busy life as an excuse, I gradually stopped keeping in touch with my parents. My father had never been the type to check in often, so that didn't bother me. I did find it a bit strange that my mother hadn't reached out, but I convinced myself that no news is good news. By the time I had only a few months left until my graduate school graduation, all communication had completely stopped. But since I was already set to return home soon, I didn't think much of it. I had received several job offers locally and considered staying, especially since my relationship would turn long distance if I returned to Japan. However, I had studied all these years to take over my father's company, and I was also concerned about my parents. So, I decided to move out of my apartment early and start preparing for my return. Maybe if I hadn't come back at that moment, my life would have taken a different path. Once my return date was finalized, I booked my flight and emailed my parents to let them know. Neither of them read the message right away, but I didn't think too much of it. At the airport, I had a big send-off from my girlfriend and friends. I was also busy messaging my friends in Japan, making plans to meet up. So, I barely paid attention to the unread messages from my parents as I boarded my flight home. After landing in Japan, I immediately caught a taxi and headed straight to my family home. It was around dusk. The lights of passing buildings and street lamps had just started to flicker on. As I gazed out the window, nostalgia washed over me at the sight of my home country. What the hell? I stood frozen in front of the mansion where I had once lived. The house was completely dark, with no lights on. The once pristine garden I was so proud of was overgrown with weeds, left to decay. I walked around to the back of the house, but there wasn't a single lit room. I head back to the main entrance. What caught my eye was the sign on the gate that read "For Sale." Below it was the name of a real estate management company and their contact number. Panic rising in my chest, I immediately called my parents. But neither of them answered. My father's phone was disconnected, and my mother's phone was out of service range. I quickly called the management company. They told me that the house had been put up for sale several months ago. They refused to disclose any further details due to privacy policies. What the hell happened? Fearing the worst, I called my father's company. Keith, my father's longtime right-hand man, answered. He had been with the company since I was a child. Come to the office immediately. I'll explain everything, he said, his voice tense. Finally, I had someone familiar to talk to, someone who could tell me what had happened to my parents. Relieved, I failed to notice the strange tone in Keith's voice. Rushing to the company, I saw him waiting for me at the entrance. Before I could speak to him, a police officer standing nearby stepped forward. We have some questions about your father. Where are my parents? Were they in an accident? Let's discuss this at the police station. Having no idea what was going on, I obediently followed the officers. My chest tightened with anxiety. Was it an accident? A crime? What was happening? For the first time in my life, I rode in a police car, being taken in for voluntary questioning. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Keith watching me. His face was twisted with an expression I had never seen before, a look of pure hatred directed at me. At the police station, I finally learned the terrible truth about what had happened while I had been too caught up in my own life to notice. My parents had already divorced. My father had been having an affair and had even remarried his mistress. Around the same time, the company had started failing, accumulating massive debt. Whether it was at the urging of his new wife or his own decision, my father had abandoned the company and disappeared with his new spouse. On top of that, he had embezzled a huge amount of company funds before vanishing, leading to a lawsuit against him. That was why the police had called me in. I suddenly remembered Keith's expression as I had driven away in the police car. That wasn't anger at me, it was the sheer hatred he harbored toward my father, channeled through me. The company was drowning in debt and had already been bought out by a foreign corporation. Most of the employees had been laid off. Because I had been overseas for so long and had no suspicious call records, the police quickly determined I wasn't involved and let me go. But this incident marked the beginning of my downward spiral. With no home and no job, I scraped together all the money I had and ended up sleeping in a cheap hotel while desperately searching for work. My father had borrowed money from relatives and acquaintances before vanishing, leaving behind a trail of resentment. None of my relatives or even my grandparents were willing to help me, in fact. Some of them outright screamed at me to repay the money my father had taken. Without a fixed address, I couldn't even apply for proper jobs, and finding part-time work was nearly impossible. Finally, I managed to land a live-in job, only to have them suddenly withdraw the offer. I had no proof, but I suspected that someone from my father's former company, who had been unfairly laid off, was working there and had spread rumors that I was the son of a criminal. To make matters worse, the media caught wind of my downfall and turned it into a sensational story. A Stanford graduate hitting rock bottom was the perfect tabloid fodder. Even though I had only been voluntarily questioned by the police, the articles made it sound as if I had been arrested. Branded as a criminal's son, I could no longer stay in that town. Using the last of my money, I decided to leave. With my phone and credit cards blocked, I lost all contact with my long-distance girlfriend, and our relationship naturally faded away. To be honest, from the moment I met her, I had thought she was the one. I was completely in love with her. But at this point, I didn't even have the luxury of dwelling on that. I had truly hit rock bottom. With nowhere else to go, I made my way to my mother's hometown. It had been years since I last saw my maternal grandparents. My father and grandfather had never gotten along well. Out of consideration for my father, my mother never invited my grandparents to our home. And when we did visit them, it was only once or twice a year. Always when my father wasn't around. It was a residential area in a rural city, so not much had changed. Walking the familiar streets, I remembered the times my mother had brought me here, and I found my way without trouble. I stopped a few meters away from my mother's childhood home. Instead of nostalgia, a wave of tension washed over me. It was just a gut feeling, but I was certain my mother wasn't here. I hadn't been able to reach her, just like my father, but I had a strange sense that she was out there, living her own life. That made it all the more likely that my presence would only be a nuisance to her, an unwanted reminder of a past she had moved on from. And what about my grandparents? What would they think of me, the son of the man who had hurt their daughter? I had come all this way without a plan, but now I found myself too afraid to knock on the door. What was I even hoping to do by coming here? Just as I turned to leave, thinking I should find a hotel in the city, a voice called out behind me. "What are you doing there?" "I'm sorry." "I'm not." As I turned around in a panic, I froze. "Grandpa." Without the slightest hint of surprise, my grandfather simply gestured toward the entrance with his chin and said, "You'll look suspicious standing around out here. Get inside." "Kyle." "My goodness, you've grown so much." My grandmother's face lit up the moment she saw me. I fumbled for words, unsure of what to say, but my grandmother motioned for me to sit down. "You must be hungry." "Wait just a moment." "No, really, I don't want to trouble you." "Oh, don't be silly. You used to call us Grandpa and Grandma all the time when you were little." She exaggerated a pout, pretending to be sad. "You're our grandson. There's no need to be so formal." My grandfather's voice was gruff. With a light step, my grandmother disappeared into the kitchen. Still tense, I sat on the sofa, staring at the tea placed in front of me, while my grandfather sat across from me in silence. I waited, expecting him to say something. Checking the clock, I saw that only 5 minutes had passed, yet it felt like an hour. The only sound in the room was the clatter of pots and pans as my grandmother cooked. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" The question came just as I reached for my teacup, unable to bear the silence any longer. Well, you can stay here. Thank you." As I struggled to find the right words, my grandmother came in carrying a tray of food. "Oh, let me help you." No, just sit down." Desperate to escape the awkward silence with my grandfather, I got up and headed to the kitchen. I took the tray from my grandmother and carried it to the dining area. Placing the soup and pickles onto the table, which was neatly covered with a tablecloth, I suddenly realized how long it had been since I had a proper meal. For weeks, I had been surviving on convenience store rice balls, cheap bread, and discounted supermarket meals. My stomach growled loudly at the sight of warm, homemade food. "You must be starving. Here, eat up, eat up. Thank you for the meal." Bringing my hands together in a quiet prayer, I took my first bite of my grandmother's cooking in years. It tasted just like my mother's, familiar, nostalgic. The warmth of the meal, the sudden relief from all my stress, and the flood of emotions nearly brought me to tears, but I held them back. That night, for the first time since returning to Japan, I slept well. "So, what are you going to do now?" The next morning, my grandfather asked me bluntly. I told him and my grandmother everything that had happened since I returned to Japan. When I asked about my mother, they only told me that she was living in the countryside but didn't specify where. As long as she was safe and well, that was enough for me. I had no intention of disrupting her life now that she had deliberately cut off contact. Apparently, my father had come here too, asking for money, leaving my grandparents with nothing but resentment. I had no desire to trouble them any further. "I just have one favor to ask." I requested that they let me use their address as my residence so I could apply for jobs. They agreed without hesitation. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call us," my grandmother said kindly. With a registered address, I was finally able to secure a job and rent a tiny, rundown apartment. It was a massive improvement compared to sleeping in a hotel. I could have looked for a better job using my degree. But I didn't want my background to be exposed. I didn't want people to find out about my father's company and the scandal surrounding it. So, I applied for jobs as a high school graduate, hiding my Stanford education. It was ironic I had worked so hard for my degree, and now I had to bury it just to survive. During the day, I worked at the cafe, and at night, I took on a second job as a designated driver for hire. It wasn't much, but at least I was no longer homeless. At first, I thought being a cafe employee wouldn't suit me. But to my surprise, I enjoyed it. Customers came for all sorts of reasons, some sat alone, some met for business discussions, some waited for friends or colleagues. Over time, I grew familiar with the regulars who showed up on the same day at the same time each week. At first, it was just exchanging greetings, but eventually, I found myself engaging in casual conversations with some of them. Among the regulars, I became particularly close with a man named Stephen, who looked to be in his 50s. He always came on Saturday evenings, after the cafe's peak hours. It seemed intentional, he preferred a quieter atmosphere. From his attire and the way he spoke, I could tell he was probably a senior executive at a large company. But I never asked about his job. We simply enjoyed our small conversations during my breaks. "I always learn something new when I talk to you." Stephen would occasionally say things like that. "I don't like being suspected or scrutinized, so I don't talk about my background." That's why I never mentioned that I studied economics in college, but there were times when Stephen would say things like, "You're more helpful than our business consultant," which caught me off guard. But in truth, I genuinely enjoyed our conversations. Sometimes, he reminded me of the discussions I had with my friends back at Stanford. And on occasion, I would think of her, the girlfriend I had lost contact with. I hadn't had the time or the mental space to think about her before, but now that my life had stabilized a little, memories of her began resurfacing. One evening, while working my designated driver job, I received a pickup request at a high-end restaurant. When I arrived, I was stunned to see that my client was none other than Stephen. For the first time, we saw each other outside the cafe. Both of us stood frozen in shock. As expected, Stephen's car was a top-tier luxury sedan from a Japanese brand. I couldn't afford to make a single mistake, so I drove with the utmost caution. My driver is off tonight since this was a private outing. I never expected to run into you here. I can't survive on just my cafe job, I replied, forcing a light-hearted laugh. Forgive me for prying, but why haven't you sought full-time employment? With your adaptability and quick thinking, you could excel anywhere. Is there a reason you're avoiding a stable job? Perhaps you want to start your own business or pursue further studies? No, nothing like that. I'd like to work full-time, but it's not that simple for me. Would you be willing to tell me why? I was alone in the car with Stephen, and to make things worse, he wasn't sober. Maybe that situation made me let my guard down. I ended up telling Stephen everything about my past, something I had never told anyone before. Then why don't you work for my company as a driver? What? To be honest, I've been thinking about scouting you for a while now. Tonight was just a lucky opportunity. You drive carefully. You're knowledgeable about business, and you have plenty of interesting conversation topics. My current driver is planning to retire and move back to the countryside, so we need someone to take his place. Are you sure I'm the right person for the job? Of course. I want you on board. Thank you. I'd be honored. There was no reason to refuse. At that point, I just needed stable, full-time work anywhere would do. As he stepped out of the car, Stephen handed me his business card. Come to this address at 2 p.m., the day after tomorrow. We'll go through a formal interview and handle your hiring paperwork. At the appointed time, I went to the company and officially secured a job. Then 5 years later, I had been working as a driver for Stephen, now formerly known to me as Mr. Thompson, the CEO, since then. I still vividly remember the shock of looking at his business card for the first time. Stephen wasn't just any executive, he was the CEO of a major corporation. As a company driver, I didn't just chauffeur Mr. Thompson, I also occasionally drove other executives. When I wasn't on the road, I spent my time cleaning and maintaining the company vehicles. Since Mr. Thompson himself had appointed me, no one openly questioned my employment, but one person in particular, Kenneth. The company's managing director clearly resented me. I heard you were just a high school graduate working dead-end jobs. You know you're the only high school graduate in this company, right? And your father was a criminal, wasn't he? Maybe you were in on it too. I wasn't sure how much he actually knew about my past, but he made no effort to hide his hostility. What my father did has nothing to do with me. Who knows? You seem to have gotten in good with Mr. Thompson, but I can't feel at ease knowing someone like you is lurking around the company. What exactly are you implying? Like father, like son. A thief's kid is a thief, too. The fact that Mr. Thompson hired you shows poor judgment on his part. I am not a thief. And don't insult Mr. Thompson. It's that attitude of yours that pisses me off. Every time I drove Kenneth somewhere, it was the same conversation. Over time, I got used to it and stopped letting it get to me. Is Kenneth still giving you trouble? During a drive to an important meeting, Mr. Thompson asked with concern. I just smiled vaguely and changed the subject. I've gotten used to it. More importantly, today's deal is a big one, isn't it? That's right. If everything goes through, it'll be a $135 million deal. But we're not the only ones after this, our rival company is competing for it too. We absolutely can't afford to mess up this presentation. That's why I've arranged for an interpreter to make sure there are no misunderstandings in communication. So the client isn't from an English-speaking country? I hadn't meant anything by the comment, but Mr. Thompson suddenly latched onto it. What makes you say that? But for some reason, Mr. Thompson keeps pressing the issue. Well, if they spoke English, you wouldn't need an interpreter, would you? Mr. Thompson's English was flawless, easily business proficient. For a detailed negotiation like this, it would actually be more efficient for him to communicate directly rather than relying on an interpreter. Plus, the company had plenty of employees with business-level English skills. There was no need to hire someone externally. The other company's CEO grew up in Germany, so he's more comfortable with German than English. Seemingly satisfied with my reasoning, Mr. Thompson relaxed his expression. Just a few minutes before we arrived, his phone rang. What do you mean? You said you'd bring them. The moment he answered, his face hardened. In the silent car, I could hear the muffled voice on the other end. It was Kenneth. Forget it. I'll handle it on my end. With that, Mr. Thompson ended the call. Sensing that now wasn't the time for questions, I focused on driving. But suddenly, he asked, "Do you speak German?" I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. I can manage a conversation, at least. I had been to Germany multiple times, and during my time at Stanford, I had several close German classmates. Their faces briefly flashed through my mind. Then, I need you to act as the interpreter. Me? Yes. I'm counting on you. I wanted to ask more, but we had already arrived at the hotel for the meeting. After handing the car off to the valet, I followed Mr. Thompson inside. Kenneth was already waiting in the lobby. The moment he spotted me, he frowned in displeasure. This is an important deal. You should wait in the parking lot as usual. No, he'll be joining us as the interpreter today. Kenneth widens his eyes in disbelief at Mr. Thompson's words. Are you serious? There's no way a high school graduate with a criminal father can handle such a role. When Kenneth told Mr. Thompson that in a calm, instructive tone, he glared at me. And you, what the hell do you think you're doing here? Know your place. Just because you're Mr. Thompson's favorite doesn't mean you can get ahead of yourself. If you feel that strongly, you're welcome to sit this one out. As Kenneth hurled insults at me in a furious rage, Mr. Thompson firmly cut him off. Kenneth finally fell silent, though his face remained twisted in frustration as he stomped off. A hotel staff member escorted us to a private dining room in the restaurant. Not long after we were seated, the clients arrived. At the sound of a knock, I stood to greet them. Sorry to keep you waiting. The moment the blonde woman entered the room and saw me, her eyes lit up in shock. Wow! I've been looking for you. Before I could react, she rushed forward and threw her arms around me. Stunned, everyone in the room, Mr. Thompson, Kenneth, and even the executives from the other company, just stared in disbelief. Amelia? As I spoke her name, she finally let go of me. I'm so glad I found you, Kyle. The CEO sitting across from us was none other than Amelia, the woman I had dated back at Stanford. She was half German, half American. After I returned to Japan and lost all means of contact, our relationship had faded into nothingness, or so I thought. I never imagined that she had actually been searching for me all this time. I was at a loss for words. What the hell is going on? Kenneth's irritated voice snapped me back to reality. This wasn't the time to be overwhelmed by emotions, this was an important business meeting. Regaining my composure, I shifted my focus back to the deal. The negotiations proceeded primarily in German. As I translated, I noticed Kenneth's face twitch in shock. You've got to be kidding me. He can actually interpret? I heard Kenneth mutter under his breath, clearly frustrated. It must have slipped out unintentionally. But Amelia didn't miss it. Of course. Kyle and I were classmates at Stanford. She said, looking at Kenneth with mild exasperation. Stanford? You're joking, right? This guy's just a high school graduate. Kenneth looked utterly dumbfounded, unable to finish his sentence as he pointed at me. I see. That makes sense. I knew I had a good eye for talent. Mr. Thompson said with a satisfied nod in my direction. From that moment on, Kenneth stopped talking, staring down at the table in silence. The business negotiations proceeded smoothly, and we even had time to enjoy the fine cuisine. I heard that your company has also been approached by our competitors. When can we expect a final decision on which partner you'll choose? Amelia's company had come to Japan to find a business partner. Both our company and a rival firm had stepped forward as candidates. We would greatly appreciate both the $135 million contract and our future partnership. We look forward to working with you. With that, Amelia stood up and extended her hand to Mr. Thompson. They shook hands, and it was agreed that the official contract would be signed at a later date. Wait a moment. Are you sure this decision is based on a thorough evaluation of the business? You're not just choosing us because you know someone here, are you? Kenneth, who had been sitting silently with his head down, suddenly spoke up. What are you trying to say? It was likely the question everyone else in the room was thinking. Even if personal connections played a role, anyone in his position would usually be thrilled to land such a massive deal. And yet, he was the only one openly questioning it. Sensing something was off, Amelia's expression hardened. Signing a $135 million contract just because you have a friend? That's quite the insult to our judgment. Or perhaps, Kenneth. Is there some reason you don't want this deal to go through? No, that's not what I meant. For example, did you make a deal with your competitors? Maybe promising to help them secure the contract in exchange for a nice reward? Kenneth's face turned pale. He stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but his words were barely coherent. I'd like to hear more about that, Amelia said, her sharp gaze locking onto Kenneth's as she gave him a cold smile. Unable to bear it any longer, Kenneth confessed everything. He had been approached by the rival company with an offer to become their vice CEO. There was a condition, though. He had to sabotage our company from the inside to put us at a disadvantage. That's why Kenneth came up with a scheme and lied about the interpreter canceling at the last minute. Amelia, who had been staying at the hotel since the day before, returned from her jog shortly before the meeting and saw an older man at the front desk kicking a German guest out of the hotel. Curious, she had stopped to ask the man what was going on. He had told her, I was supposed to be the interpreter for today's meeting, but that man suddenly ordered me to leave. At the time, she didn't understand the significance of the incident. But when she arrived at the negotiation room and recognized Kenneth as the same man from the hotel lobby, she realized something was off. Confronted with her direct question, why did you send the interpreter away? Kenneth turned deathly pale. Under pressure, he admitted everything. Apparently, the rival company had been struggling financially for some time, and they approached Kenneth in a desperate attempt to secure this contract. In the end, not only did Kenneth lose his chance at the vice CEO position, but he was also swiftly dismissed at the next shareholders' meeting and forced out of the company. Rumors of his misconduct spread quickly among the employees, most of whom had already disliked him. And of course, the media didn't ignore the scandal. Unlike in my case, everything written here is true, so there's no room for sympathy. As for me, I was promoted from company driver to the executive secretary's office. But I still continued to drive Mr. Thompson personally. After everything that happened, I finally told Amelia the full story of what had transpired since I returned to Japan. She had been looking for me ever since we lost contact. All this time, I had thought I was alone, that I had no one to rely on. But in reality, there had been someone searching for me, thinking about me, and wanting to reconnect. Just knowing that was enough to make me feel like I had been saved. We started dating again and eventually decided to get married. I had been raised in comfort and privilege for most of my life, so even though my parents had abandoned me, I held no resentment toward them. Still, the loneliness I had carried all this time, she would be the one to fill that void. And someday, I hope there will be a day when I can introduce her to my mother.